Hey everyone, welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and I'm glad you're here today. A few years ago, I was co-facilitating a men's group. I actually don't remember how long ago it was. But in this particular group, we were deep in conversation about attachment wounds, childhood experiences, mother wounds, and all the ways that those early imprints continue to show up decades later in our adult relationships. The men were sharing personal stories about feeling unseen or misunderstood, being criticized, responsible for everybody else's happiness, and never quite feeling like they were enough. As I was listening to them, a thought crystallized, and I offered something that changed the direction of the conversation. I said, sometimes if we do not think we can be loved, we will substitute being needed. The room went quiet for a minute. And I thought it was interesting because nobody disputed the idea that people become necessary. They skipped right over that part. Everybody took that as a given. What surprised me was where the resistance to what I had said surfaced. As we began exploring the difference between being needed and being loved, and then the possibility that the deeper goal might actually be to be chosen, some of the men grew skeptical and they pushed back. Again, not skeptical that relationships organized around need. They knew that those relationships existed. They were skeptical that relationships organized around choice existed. Some of them genuinely questioned whether relationships like that were even real. And I remember thinking how fascinating that was, because they weren't questioning what they had experienced. They were questioning something they didn't even have a model for. They'd never seen that type of relationship. Many of them had witnessed or been part of relationships built around duty, around obligation, around sacrifice, traditional gender roles, responsibility, and dependence. But they had not ever seen two fully functioning adults freely choosing each other. Not because they had to, but because they genuinely wanted to. I've had that conversation in groups since then. I've had that conversation in female groups. I've had it in individual sessions with clients. I keep returning to it because I think it points to something that so many of us carry. That belief and that trade-off that we make, not consciously, that if I can't be loved, I'll be needed. And while being needed can feel meaningful, even nourishing, it is never an adequate substitute for being loved. I want to give you some theories and different authors who have written similar ideas. Attachment theory helps us understand why being needed is not a valid substitute for being loved. Dr. Sue Johnson, the creator of emotionally focused therapy and author of Hold Me Tight and other books, teaches that we are wired for connection from the moment we enter the world. She says every child is asking the same questions. Am I safe? Do I matter? Will someone come when I need them? And can I count on the people I love? I was listening to an interview that she did. I'm not sure when she did the interview. I was listening to it, I think, a year or two ago. And she started talking about when she entered the field, She was doing work with couples. And she said, couples work back then was a shit show. She said, you're sitting in the room with a couple and you're just watching them fight. And she said, I would talk to my colleagues. Their couples weren't getting better. My couples weren't getting better. Nobody really knew why. Nobody knew what to do with a couple. And she said, I had learned about attachment theory, which started with John Bowlby back in the late 40s, early 50s over in the UK following the end of World War II. And this was something I didn't know that she said in the interview. She said, at the time, we understood attachment as something that children needed. And she said, I had this question, what if these attachment needs and the attachment styles that come about based on early life experiences, what if they don't just stop in childhood? What if they actually follow people well into their adult relationships? And she said, I was laughed at in the field. People disregarded me. People thought I was crazy for thinking this. And she said, oh, I started figuring out how to apply that with the couples I was working with. And they started getting better. She said, so then I started the research. I think she said this was early to mid 80s. I entered the field just 10 years later, a decade later. And I didn't know, even at that time, the idea that attachment and the attachment wounds that we receive in childhood follow us into our adult relationships was just a given. Like, yeah, of course it does. I didn't know her backstory until I was listening to this interview. She describes attachment figures as providing what she calls both a safe haven and a secure base. A safe haven, she says, is where we go when life hurts. A secure base is what gives us the confidence to move into the world, to take risks, and to grow. One of the things I most appreciate about Johnson's work is how directly she challenges a myth that runs especially deep in American culture. The idea that healthy adults shouldn't need anyone. She argues that dependence, or let's say interdependence, is not weakness. Healthy dependence is simply part of being human. We all need people, we all need connection, and we all need relationships. The goal was never to stop needing people. The goal is to develop relationships where that need is healthy and mutual. I think there's a meaningful difference between saying, I need you, and saying, I need you to need me. One of those statements comes from connection. The other usually comes from fear or insecurity. And I think many of us learned the second long before we ever experienced the first. If you've listened to my podcast, you've probably heard me say that I don't even know how many times. Children are remarkably adaptive. When love feels uncertain, conditional, inconsistent, or unavailable, children rarely conclude that the adults around them are the problem, that the adults are limited or struggling in some way. Instead, they conclude that something must be wrong with them. They're too much, not enough, too emotional, too sensitive, too needy. I'm invisible. I'm a burden. And once those conclusions take root, not necessarily up in our brain like a belief that we think, but more in the body, that felt sense conclusion. Children will spend years trying to solve the problem that they believe they are. Some do that by achieving or becoming caretakers. They can become peacekeepers, rescuers, or simply disappear. The strategy varies, but the goal is always the same. Stay connected. Don't get abandoned. Don't get rejected. And find a way to matter. One of the most reliable ways children discover they can matter is by becoming needed. If I can't be loved, maybe I can become useful. Maybe I can even become indispensable. Maybe I can make myself so essential to everyone else's functioning that no one will leave me behind. This is where Pia Mellody's work on codependence becomes so clarifying. Mellody teaches that healthy adults recognize their inherent value, a worth that exists independent of performance, achievement, productivity, or usefulness. But when toxic shame enters the picture, we begin searching outside ourselves for evidence that we matter. And being needed becomes that evidence. If people depend on me, then I must be valuable. If people bring me their problems, then I must matter. If people can't function without me, I must be important. But notice what's happening. Our value has become tied to someone else's dependence. And that's a pretty fragile foundation on which to build a life. Culture reinforces these adaptations. Many men receive messages, spoken and unspoken, that their value comes from providing, being the protector, the problem solver, the hero, the rescuer, the breadwinner. Many women receive their own version of the same message. Be nurturing, be accommodating, be selfless. Take care of everyone. Keep the family together. Don't ask for too much. Don't expect too much. And don't take up too much space. Emily Nagoski writes about what she calls the human giver syndrome. The expectation that certain people, particularly women, should endlessly give while expecting very little in return. And that is a very similar message to the attachment adaptation that I'm describing in this episode. Many of us learned how to become valuable before we ever learned how to become known. Think about that for a minute. We learned how to perform, how to help, how to rescue or achieve, provide, and take care of others. But we never learned how to simply be known, because being known is vulnerable, especially when that didn't happen at younger ages. Being useful feels safer. If I'm useful, I have a role. If I'm needed, I have a purpose. If I'm indispensable, maybe you'll stay. But if I simply show you who I am, that's risking rejection. And these adaptations don't disappear when we grow up. They come with us into dating, into marriage, into parenting, careers, and friendships. When I talk about being known, I think it's important to understand that this isn't something we're just supposed to figure out as adults. Ideally, it starts very young, long before we can perform, long before we can achieve, and long before we can really provide anything useful. So think about a baby. A baby contributes absolutely nothing. A baby can't really earn love. A baby can't achieve. They can't rescue anybody. They can't provide. A baby can't even feed themselves. And yet, healthy parents are completely captivated by them. I remember when my daughters were babies, there were nights when I would rock them to sleep. And after they finally drifted off, I would just keep holding them. Not because they needed something, and I wasn't just avoiding doing another task that needed to be done. Not because I was really trying to accomplish anything. I just couldn't get enough of them. As they got older and started elementary school, I remember watching them leave for school. My two oldest would walk to the end of the street to catch the bus, and I'd stand at the window and watch them walk down the sidewalk. My later two, we were in a different house, and I'd walk out onto the front porch, and I would watch until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Nothing productive was happening. I wasn't doing it for safety. They weren't accomplishing anything. They weren't performing. I don't even know if they knew I was standing there watching them. They weren't making me proud by winning an award, but they were mine, and I delighted in them. I think that's one of the earliest ways children learn what it means to be known. Long before they do anything impressive, before they become useful, before they become responsible, someone simply enjoys their existence. Someone delights in them. Someone wants to be with them, not because of what they do, but just because of who they are. And when that experience happens consistently, children begin developing a very different internal message. Not, I matter because I'm useful. Not, I matter because I perform well. Not, I matter because I take care of everyone. But instead, I matter because I exist. That's the foundation of being known. Unfortunately, not everyone receives enough of those experiences. Sometimes parents are overwhelmed. Sometimes they're struggling with their own trauma, or they're emotionally unavailable for other reasons. They might love their children deeply, but they don't know how to communicate delight, curiosity, and emotional presence. And so many adults arrive in therapy having never fully experienced what it feels like to be known. They're loved, maybe. They're appreciated when they get it right. They're needed. Yeah, absolutely. But known? Not really. Not in my experience. And that's why healing often feels awkward. Because healing isn't just learning new skills. Healing is having new experiences. I often ask clients if there's a safe person in their life, a friend, a sibling, a spouse, someone who feels emotionally safe enough to practice with. And then I encourage them to have an honest conversation. Something like, there's something I'm working on. I've spent most of my life trying to be useful, trying to be needed, and I'm trying to learn what it feels like to let people actually know me. That conversation alone is vulnerable because now we're stepping out of performance. We're stepping out of usefulness. We're stepping out of roles. And we're stepping out from behind the curtain and letting someone see us. not this polished version or the productive version, but the real version. Learning to be known happens one small risk at a time. You tell the truth about something you're feeling. You share a fear, or you share a dream. You share an insecurity. You let someone support you instead of always being the supporter. You let someone care about you instead of always being the caregiver. Over time, your nervous system begins collecting evidence. Evidence that people don't only stay because you're useful. Evidence that people don't stay because you solve their problems. Evidence that people don't only stay because they needed you. Some people stay because they genuinely know you and they genuinely care. That's a very different experience. And for a lot of people, it's one they've been waiting for their entire lives. I have 2 clients that I work with individually, and they met each other in a men's group that I facilitate. We had been talking about this idea in group and in their individual sessions. The one has a condo down in southern Utah, about 4 hours away from Salt Lake. The other one in the past has been a climbing guide down in southern Utah during the summer months. They become friends through group, and they're also friends outside of group. The one who was guiding had asked the other if he could use his condo when he was going to be down in southern Utah. The other one said, yeah, of course. A day or two later, the one who owns the condo called the other one who was borrowing it and said, hey, I need to know if you are my friend because I have the condo or if you're just my friend. He took a risk. The one who was borrowing the condo understood why his friend needed to ask this question. And he responded saying, I'm your friend, and listed the reasons why he found his friendship valuable. Not in a performative way, but in a way that says, I know you. I see you. The one who had made the phone call said, that's what I thought, but I hope you understand why I had to ask. The other one said, I know why you needed to ask, and I'm glad that you felt you could. Many relationships become quietly organized around an unconscious bargain. One person needs, one person is needed. One person rescues, one person depends. One person overfunctions, and one person underfunctions. Neither person is doing anything wrong. And we might mistake this for great pairing. Neither person consciously designed it that way. They're simply bringing their attachment strategies into adulthood. And for a while up front, it works. The rescuer feels valuable. The dependent partner feels secure. Everyone knows their role. And there's a certain kind of stability in it. But eventually, something shifts. People grow. People get tired. People enter therapy, and they start to recover. And suddenly, the arrangement that once felt like security starts feeling like a trap. The rescuer becomes exhausted. The dependent partner feels controlled. And both people begin feeling unseen. Not because either of them is bad, but because neither of them is truly known. One is valued for what they provide. The other is valued for what they need. But that doesn't leave room for them to fully be themselves. David Schnarch's work on differentiation speaks directly to this dynamic. Differentiation is the capacity to stay connected to another person while remaining connected to yourself. To be close without disappearing. To love without losing yourself. And to maintain genuine intimacy without requiring dependence. Relationships organized around need often struggle with differentiation because one person's identity is built on being necessary. Or in a relationship, you can have two people whose identity is built on being necessary, but in different ways. If my worth depends on being needed, then you starting to grow or change is going to feel threatening. Independence can feel threatening. Your confidence, your success, they all register as danger signals. Not because any person here is a bad person, but because the nervous system is hearing something terrifying. You're becoming less dependent on me. And if my value comes from your dependence, that feels like the ground is shifting beneath my feet. I've worked with quite a few couples that, as we're talking about the problems and what brought them into therapy, the husband will pinpoint and say, our problems began when she got a job. Now, I don't think that's true, but she started differentiating. She started making money. She started having adult conversations and not just spending all of her time with young kids. I think about a woman that I worked with years ago. She was a stay-at-home mom with 5 children. She had gotten married at 19, and she'd spent decades inside that marriage. She was processing years of betrayal, finding out her husband had a sex addiction and narcissistic behavior. She was working incredibly hard in therapy. Her husband was attending sessions with one of our therapists at Healing Paths. But simply attending your session and doing therapy are not always the same thing. She was working hard. He came to his sessions. She would periodically raise the possibility of divorce. She would say, he doesn't think I'll ever do it. I think she was right. I don't think he ever thought she would do it because she needed him. She hadn't had a job in over 20 years. And she would raise the possibility of divorce in another session. And then she'd immediately pull it back and say, but I'll be poor. And I would say, because she hadn't worked outside the home since she married, yeah, that fear is real. In other sessions, she would make comments about working mothers. She would express concerns about children needing their mothers at home, worries for the outcome for kids who were raised by women who worked. I heard these comments more than once. She would say, well, if I have to be a working mom, my children are just screwed. And I'd sit there thinking, you know, I have children and I'm literally sitting here at work. One session I finally said, you know, I'm a working mom, right? And she burst out laughing. She said, oh my gosh, I wasn't even thinking about that. I have said this so many times, Jackie. I've just been sitting here insulting you. I was laughing with her and I was like, I didn't take it as an insult because my kids aren't screwed. They're not losers. They're not degenerates of society. But something slowly started to shift for her. I wouldn't say her view changed rapidly, but she started to hear her own fear beneath the words. What she was actually saying wasn't that working moms were bad. What she was saying was, I'm terrified. I'm terrified of supporting myself. I'm terrified of rebuilding my life. I'm terrified of who I might be outside this marriage. And honestly, her fear wasn't irrational. It would be hard. I didn't sugarcoat that for her. She said, I'm going to need a new car in the next couple of years. And I told her, you'll receive alimony and child support. And fortunately, your husband makes good money, but it'll still be difficult. It will probably take years for you to financially rebuild. But I also told her something else. You don't yet realize what you're going to discover about yourself. You don't know what you're capable of. And you don't understand how empowering it feels to buy your own car with money you've earned. Somewhere along the way for her, she had become entirely organized around roles: mother, wife, caretaker, support system. And she had completely lost sight of herself. She had spent decades being needed. And in doing so, she had forgotten who she was outside of what she provided. I wasn't working with her when she eventually bought her next car, but she did text me and said, hey, Jackie, I just wanted to let you know I bought my car today and I love it. I just responded and said, I'm so proud of you. I knew you could. This is one of the hidden costs of organizing a life around being needed. Eventually, you forget who you are. You know who everyone else needs you to be, but you lose touch with what you enjoy, what matters to you, what excites you, what dreams you still carry, what kind of life you would choose if you weren't holding everything and everyone together. And I think that's exactly why that conversation with those men from group has stayed with me all of these years. Because what they struggled to believe wasn't that people become needed. We see evidence of that everywhere. What they struggled to believe was that people could remain together because they freely chose one another. Not because they had to, not because they were trapped, not because of economic dependence or rigid roles, or the fact that one person couldn't survive without the other, but because they genuinely wanted each other. I don't think that's exclusively a religious problem or a cultural one, though I do think some traditions spend considerable energy teaching commitment while spending very little time teaching differentiation. We learn how to stay. We learn how to sacrifice. We learn how to fulfill our roles. But we don't always learn how to remain fully ourselves while staying deeply connected. The healthiest relationships are not built on dependence alone. They're also not built on radical independence. Sue Johnson would remind us that healthy relationships require attachment. Emily Nagoski would remind us that genuine desire requires freedom. David Schnarch would tell us that true intimacy requires differentiation. And together, they point toward the same truth. Healthy love holds both connection and freedom at the same time. I can reach for you, and I can stand on my own 2 feet. I need you sometimes, and I don't need you to need me. I choose you, and you choose me. I think that's the real work of adulthood. Not becoming unnecessary and not achieving radical self-sufficiency. Not eliminating our need for others, but learning slowly at first and deeply that our worth was never dependent on our usefulness. And that the deepest form of intimacy isn't being needed. It's being known. It's being seen. It's being understood in the fullness of who you are. And then discovering that someone who doesn't need you to complete them, rescue them, or save them, chooses you. Thanks for listening today. If something in this episode resonated with you, I'd encourage you to sit with the question, am I organizing my relationships around being needed? And what might it look like to slowly start practicing letting yourself be known instead? At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.